Welcome back. This time we're talking about Person of Interest, Season 5, Episode 6, A More Perfect Union. And that's a name that's going to have more than one meaning by the time we get to the end of this episode. Now at the start, this seems to have a similar format to last week's episode, in which we have our Number of the Week A storyline along with a Samaritan B storyline, and then about a third of the way through we get a C story. Only this time it's actually the Number of the Week that really doesn't have a lot to do with the central plot, and also actually none of the stories really connect like they did last week, but they all do further the story either directly or thematically. So like last week, I'm going to start with a story that's pretty much the most self-contained, and in this episode that is the Number of the Week. We start out and there is a new number, but instead of it being our usual Social Security number, it's actually a wedding license number. And it turns out that John and Finch are going to have to crash a wedding. But before they can do that, John's going to have to get an invitation, and so he has to pose as a security guard for a stripper that's hired for the bride's bachelorette party. Meanwhile, Finch is impersonating the groom's long-lost Irish uncle. With invitations in hand, they head off to this very wealthy area outside of the city, and it turns out that the bride is an heiress to this horse racing family that have made millions upon millions of dollars with horse racing and raising horses. While the bride's sister is the one that's set to take over the family business, the bride-to-be is still set to inherit around $300 million. So with her husband to be a college student, it quickly puts the father of the bride right at the top of potential suspects. Finch leaves Root behind in the city to stay in the subway station so she can listen out for new numbers. Of course, another number does come, and she ends up pawning that off on Fosco, which will eventually lead us to our C story, which I'll get to later. Well, once John and Finch get to the family estate, they find it surrounded by protesters who are claiming that the bride's father is doping his horses and are laying down claims of animal cruelty as well as cheating in his horse racing. This, of course, adds to the list of potential suspects. Still not sure who the potential victim is or who the perpetrator could be, John and Finch decide that the best way to keep everyone alive and safe is to ensure that the wedding goes off without a hitch. And even if that includes Finch serenading the couple at the wedding reception. During the actual wedding ceremony, however, they both notice some uninvited guests who seem to be armed and dressed as the protesters were outside. With a last-minute assist from Root, who has crashed the wedding posing as a caterer, they subdue the assassins and quickly realize that neither the bride nor the groom is the intended victim. It's actually the family wedding photographer. Working together to rescue the photographer from her would-be assassins, they discover that she accidentally took a photo that she shouldn't have, namely the bride's sister doping horses, even though her father had expressly ordered her not to do so. With the immediate threat taken care of and the would-be killers locked up in the wine cellar, John, Finch, and Root decide to enjoy the wedding and not announce what has happened to allow the family one final night of joy before, as John puts it, their world crashes tomorrow, which has some very scary connotations as we get into the last acts of this episode. Moving on to the B storyline of this episode, we return to Shaw, who is still captured by Greer and Samaritan and undergoing simulations as they try to figure out where the machine is being kept. And we learn that there's been another 317 simulations since the last episode. With Greer beginning to realize that Shaw's not going to break, he decides to take a different tact and take Shaw on a field trip into the city. First we see them in a park, and Shaw is looking around and she quickly realizes that just about everyone around them is a Samaritan agent. While they're there, Greer points her attention to two men talking up on a bridge nearby. It turns out they're both high-frequency traders, and because of some kind of fraud that they committed, a number of companies went out of business, including two that provided care to needy people. One providing vaccines to third world countries, and the other providing low-cost air conditioning units. Because of their actions, Greer implies that they're responsible for deaths totaling into the hundreds. The next time we see them, they're in some kind of high-end establishment, once again looking at two men having a secretive conversation. One of them works for a company that produces parts for aircraft, and apparently he has just made a deal to use some shoddy material in their products that Samaritan is predicting that within the next 5 years could lead to as many as 7 plane crashes and as many as 2,000 deaths. The obvious point that Greer's trying to make with this is that he and Samaritan are acting much more proactively than the machine and our heroes, making them the good guys and our heroes who are trying to stop Samaritan the true bad guys. While Shaw points out that his ploy is not going to work, Greer notes that while they're no longer surrounded by Samaritan agents like they were earlier in the episode, she still hasn't made an attempt to escape. And that comment seems to affect Shaw more than just about anything else he's said up to this point. The third stop on Greer's little field trip is outside a building where apparently a group of Chechen rebels are plotting an attack on the Russian consulate in New York City, trying to start a new war between Russia and the United States, thereby weakening both of their enemies. Of course, Samaritan agents quickly close in on the building, kill all the rebels, and take their makeshift bomb. Finally, as the episode is drawing to a close, we return to Shaw and Greer on top of some building, and there she meets the kid who provided Samaritan's voice to Root last season. And he talks to Shaw about how humanity has supposedly gone beyond the point where it could destroy itself. And this is something Samaritan does not believe. That it has to do what it can to keep humanity from destroying itself. And then we see a distant explosion that Samaritan says is the bomb at the Russian consulate. This leads us to momentarily wonder whether or not Samaritan purposely planted the bomb after killing the Chechen rebels, but then we see a bunch of further explosions as the war that Samaritan is warning Shaw about destroys the city. And then we realize that the big shock of this episode is once again they have fooled us, and this entire segment of Shaw taking her field trip was another simulation. Just how much did Greer and his simulation get to Shaw at this point, we're left to wonder. But it does seem like this sunk in a lot more than their previous attempts to try to get her to outright betray her friends. And finally, we have our C story, which will eventually lead us to the nail-biting cliffhanger that ends this episode. As I noted before, Root got a new number, and instead of investigating it herself, she wanted to go to the wedding, so she hands it off to Fosco, also leaving him with Bear. The number is Howard Carpenter, a civil planner for the city who's in charge of underground tunnels. Of course, when we hear underground tunnels, we start thinking about the machine's location and wonder exactly where this could be going. As we learned last episode, Fosco is investigating the increasing number of missing persons, which we know are most likely related to Samaritan, but of course he doesn't know about Samaritan. And we see he even has created his own little pushpin board where he has photos of various missing people that he's investigating. Fosco follows him to a park where he sees him meeting with Bruce Moran, Elias's old ally, who is now investigating this new player in town, except like Fosco, he's being kept in the dark about the true nature of what's going on and could very easily stumble into something that's going to end up costing him his life. Well, it turns out Carpenter is Moran's contact with the city when Moran's trying to get certain projects okayed for the various crime families in the city. Carpenter is there to confront him about a new permit that's been requested because he didn't get payment for it. Moran's a bit confused because it's nothing that he requested. After the two part, Fosco confronts Bruce, and the two of them have a conversation about Carpenter's involvement with the crime families. When Fosco reminds Bruce that Elias had asked him to stay out of this business, Bruce in turn kind of hits a button when he realizes that, like him, Fosco is being kept in the dark about the true nature of this new player. Fosco does learn, however, that the permit is apparently to demolish a tunnel, which again makes us start thinking about the machine, even though Samaritan and company don't know where the machine is. By the time Fosco gets back to the precinct, Carpenter has joined the list of missing people. So Fosco starts investigating the permit in question and discovers where the work was supposed to be done. So he and Bear go out to investigate. Once there, Bear starts acting really funny, and soon he discovers the body of not only Bruce and Carpenter, but Krupa from last episode, as well as a bunch of other people that were on his missing persons list. Fosco takes some quick pictures and tries to contact John and company, but before he can, the scheduled demolition begins. And as Bear flees the falling debris, the last thing we see before we go to credits is Fosco being hit by bricks and collapsing on the ground. And thus we have our cliffhanger. Now on a programming note, let me say that CBS is obviously dumping this show. After having 2 episodes the last 2 weeks, we have 3 this week. And my plan through all of this is to watch each episode, then do my recap review, then watch the next one. So although this episode, by the time it gets onto YouTube, the other episodes may have already aired, I have not seen them yet, and it will be the case for the next 2 episodes that we get this week. Now, there are several things I wanted to touch on about this episode. First of all, the cliffhanger. We have 2 very beloved characters, Fosco and Bear, in mortal danger. It appears that Bear has the better chance of escaping because it looks like Fosco is down for the count at this point. I'm hoping that's just that he's going to be injured and is in the hospital and is not killed. As I've said several times in videos for this season, I've been really worried about Fosco, especially with them keeping him in the dark, and I'm hoping that he can learn the truth before anything permanent happens to him, and I really hope nothing does. And of course, this really seems to tie in with John's final comment at the wedding about how they're allowing the family to have one good night before their world caves in on them. And it really feels like our heroes, in this case John, Finch, and Root, are themselves having one final good day before everything goes to hell. We're down to about 7 episodes at this point, so it could mean specifically whatever happens to Fosco, or it could mean that we're going to be on a fast track for these final 7 episodes and these number of the week type deals where we had a bit of more normalcy as in the past. And while we're on the subject of Fosco, I do like the fact that once again we get to see him be a good detective. Now, we met him originally as a dirty cop, but as we've learned over the course of the show, he wasn't always he wasn't always a dirty cop, and in fact, he actually is a good detective. And I was a little remiss in not mentioning it in my recap of last episode, but it was really nice to see John say nice things about Fosco, especially after I had kind of complained earlier in the season about how mean John was to him. Once again, I hope that's not a precursor to the end of Fosco. Another character who had some really solid moments was Root. At the end, when she and Finch are sharing the last dance, she confronts him over keeping her in the dark about how his own simulations of the fight between Samaritan and the machine are going so poorly for the machine. And she once again brings up the argument of arming the machine. In turn, Finch talks about how his argument against doing so is not about his fears of what the machine would do, but more so about what they would do with so much power. This, of course, echoes a number of arguments they've had over a variety of subjects about the ongoing war between the machine and Samaritan. And finally, while we're still talking about Root, I love the revelation that she wanted to be at the wedding not to kick butt or anything like that, but she was just simply lonely. Moving on to Shaw, I have one quick note, numerically. When we saw Jeff Blackwell become Samaritan's newest agent back in episode 2, Snafu, he was agent number 704. Well, it turns out that Samaritan is continuing to recruit agents at a pretty high pace, because when Shaw and Greer are at the park and one of the agents is a woman pushing a baby carriage, we see that her agent number is 882. Which does lead to a sidetrack question on when Team Machine take out Samaritan's agents, does he replace those particular numbers with new agents, or does he keep going adding up at the top? Just something to think about. And finally, we have the fact that Shaw's entire arc in this episode was once again a simulation. I did not see that coming. In Shaw's previous episode, I knew something was up, and I figured at some point in time, especially after she shot John, that some part of it was either going to be in her head or some kind of simulation like that. But this episode, I did not see it coming until we saw half of New York burning, and then I realized that there was more to this than first meets the eye. And it was kind of gutsy to try that same ploy twice, but it worked both times. This was another really solid episode, again, where you can see them using the traditional format, but playing with it and keeping it not the same from episode to episode. Tweaking the formula just a little bit to keep it fresh. And as I mentioned before, with sort of the ominous note about the final good day before the world crashes, I have to wonder if we're going to have more episodes like this, or if we're going to be in for more of a standard linear storyline as we go towards the end. Well, as always, let me know what you thought of this episode. Let me know what you thought of my comments about it. Please comment below. As always, you can subscribe to my channel. Check out some of my other reviews. And until next time, watch out for Samaritan.